it was a labor of love. I loved every minute of it. And it's good to see it finally in print. And because I want people to know about the amazing adventures of these women who were ahead of their time and who single-handedly helped, were frontier women who had great accomplishments, including Julia Bennett, who was the first woman to own and operate a dude ranch in Montana.
Julia, let's talk about her for a second. But first, I want to get to the title, Burning the Breeze. It's a compelling title. It jumps out at you. But what in the world does it mean?
Well, Burning the Breeze is, I actually, as I was researching the book, I was struggling with the title, and I came across a dictionary of Western slang, and Burning the Breeze jumped out at me because burning the breeze is Western slang for riding as fast as you can. And that's what these women did. And I thought it really evoked these women's lives. And I thought I might start by just reading a short excerpt from the beginning of the book to help set the scene for people who don't know anything about the story. It's short, but it will, I think, help you understand, help readers understand about Julia Bennett and the women who came before her. So the book starts out in 1931 when Julia Bennett goes to New York for the first time to try to find guests for her dude ranch. So on a chilly February morning in 1931, Mrs. Julia Bennett, who had just a few days earlier had arrived on a train from her native Montana, stood by the door of New York City's Northern Pacific Railway office. She didn't know a soul, and she only had enough money to last a week if she didn't eat much. Despite these daunting circumstances, Julia, a striking 51-year-old woman with an aquiline profile and dark blonde hair, exuded an air of confidence. She sported a spotted cowhide vest, a silk neckerchief, and a black felt bolero. And since she was now in Manhattan, she had traded her signature cowboy boots for a pair of black pumps that added a few inches to her 5'4" frame. I had never been in the big city alone before, Julia wrote many years later. And when I arrived in New York, I was so frightened, I didn't know what to do. Those who knew her said she was fearless. But on this wintry day in 1931, she was desperate. Julia Bennett was in Manhattan to find guests for her new dude ranch, the Diamond J, the first in Montana to be exclusively owned and operated by a woman. The timing could not have been worse. The stock market had crashed 16 months earlier, and the economy was continuing its rapid downward spiral into what soon would become known as the Great Depression. Unemployment stood at nearly 16%, and food riots were starting to break out in some parts of the country. There was hardly a man or woman in the country whose attitude toward life had not been affected in some degree by the sudden and brutal shattering of hope, wrote historian Frederick Lewis Allen that same year. In nearby Central Park, homeless men had set up an informal camp in its recently emptied reservoir. They derisively named it Hooverville after the President of the United States. The richest Americans, however, still owned 40% of the nation's wealth. And it was this group of elite people, Julia Bennett, an accomplished big game hunter, was targeting. A veneer of prosperity still was evident at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and 46th Street, where she stood outside the Northern Pacific office. In these parts of the city, women still dressed in fur coats and had the means to shop at Saks Fifth Avenue and have lunch at Schraff's. Julia herself had no steady income and hadn't laid eyes on her ne'er-do-well husband, Anson, in more than a decade. Although their son was now grown, she was raising their 16-year-old daughter alone. Julia urgently needed money to pay off the $13,000 in debt that she had been loaned by a group of Montana businessmen to finance the construction and outfitting of her new ranch, which she had designed and built with the help of a few out-of-work wranglers. She was planning to open it to guests for the summer season in just 4 months. $13,000 was no small change. It was the same amount it had cost Charles Lindbergh to finance his solo flight across the Atlantic 4 years earlier, and about $200,000 in today's dollars. I was broke and way in debt, so I realized I must get the ranch booked. But how? Julia wrote. Times were hard throughout the country, but they were especially hard in Montana, the only state that had lost population in the previous year's US Census. Although penniless, what Julia Bennett did have in spades was energy, charm, and resourcefulness. And she hoped that some of the wealthy East Coasters that she planned to meet still had enough money to spend their summer out on the range, living their idealized version of the cowboy life. Back in Montana, Julia wore jeans and a plaid flannel shirt when she was working and hunting on her ranch. But here in New York, she dressed as if she were in a motion picture Western. She knew what she was selling. She knew her subject well. Among the settlers arriving in Virginia City in the Montana Territory in 1864 had been Julia's young, recently widowed grandmother, Elizabeth Nave Martin, and her 8-year-old daughter, Lulie. They were fleeing their home in northern Missouri, where a civil war within the Civil War had turned neighbor against neighbor and left them with no apparent option other than escape. So that helps set the scene for this book about these three amazing women.
And I love the way you take us there. Even your description of the railroad office on that particular day and that sense of it, I could really feel I'm standing on a corner here and I've got to come up with something quick because I'm otherwise about to lose my livelihood and my land. What was it inside of this person that made her feel that she could overcome the economy, overcome perhaps negative connotations of being a woman in business at the time, where she might not be trusted by the men whose dollars she's seeking? What was it that in her that told her she could sell this?
Well, I think there were several things. Her father was Benjamin Franklin Bembrick, who had also come from Missouri, and he had gone west in 1849 for the gold rush when he was still a young man. He ended up settling in the Montana Territory in the Jefferson Valley in the early 1860s, when it was there were not many people living there. He became a buffalo hunter. He helped kill buffalo for people who were traveling on the stagecoach. He was an avid hunter, and her mother, Lulu, who had come from Missouri out to Montana Territory with her mother, was also a strong woman and had grown up there. So Julia had strong parents who had raised her on a ranch where she was required to do lots of things on her own. But she also had a strong Christian Science faith that really helped her, positive attitude that made her feel that, the positive attitude made her feel that she could do these things if she set her mind to it. And she was also desperate. Her husband had left her. She needed the money. She had worked on a few dude ranches as a cook, and so she knew how they operated. And she had been given the name of one person in New York City who she might contact, who had written to ask for information. And that was all she had. And she ended up in New York City alone, all by herself. And she managed, through her charm and resourcefulness, to build a successful dude ranch that ended up attracting well-known people and celebrities from all over the country.
Tell me about the ranch itself. You've been there, right? What's it like? What's the setting?
The Diamond J is still an operating dude ranch. It's in a beautiful setting, overlooked by the Spanish Peak Mountains. It's in a quiet valley, and the cabins that Julia had built are still there, can still stay in them. So Julia she knew who her customers were, her clients were. She knew that they were wealthy people, mostly East Coasters, who expected the best. And so she didn't scrimp. She bought the finest North Carolina furniture. She bought china from Chicago with the Diamond J ranch brand. And those things have stood the test of time. And you can still even see some of the trophies, hunting trophies that she managed to kill, hanging on the walls in the Diamond J. So it's like taking a step back in time, and the guests can still do many of the things that they did when Julia ran it, ride horses, take trips to Yellowstone National Park. It's a historic place and a fascinating place.
It sounds it. So what about when you go back, this is like stepping into a time machine, because we begin in the 1930s and then we get into the time machine and it takes us back to a time when the country was split and in flames in those days right before the Civil War. And you talked about the toughness of her mother and her grandmother. Grandmother decides that Missouri is not the place to be at this time. And today you might get in a car and make that drive, but that trip at that time had to have been onerous.
It was, I don't know how people did it, quite frankly, in my research. Julia's grandmother, Lizzie Nave Martin, was a young widow. Her husband had died. Their daughter, Lulu, was very young, 7 years old. And the Nave family were, the men in the family had been in the Confederate Army. Lizzie's brother had been in the Confederate Army. Her father was a Southerner. They had come from Tennessee years before. And so one of the things I learned during my research about Missouri at that time, it really was neighbor against neighbor. And many of those who supported the cause of the South decided to move out of the state, and many of them went out west to the Montana Territory. And so the Nave family embarked in a covered wagon train. They left Missouri in August 1863. They overwintered in Colorado, and they ended up in Virginia City in the Montana Territory in April 1864. So they encountered many hardships along the way, encountered death, encountered difficulties finding food and water. And they successfully made it to Virginia City, where Lizzie, who, because she was a young widow, she still owed money on her husband. She had to pay her husband's debts off. Mm. And she was a seamstress. And so that's how she started to earn money and did it successfully. And that's the kind of, I think, gumption that Julia had, and she learned it from her grandmother and her mother.
And of course, they're going to a working ranch where you're in the you're out with the herd all day. Or tell me about though. So they're not in a dude ranch. This is not a dude ranch situation,
right? They were in a real ranch out in the middle of nowhere at the time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So Lulu, Lizzie's daughter Lulu, ended up marrying Benjamin Franklin Bembrick. She was 15 years old when they got married. Ben was 34. Ben had been married before and was widowed and had a 2-year-old daughter. So, and I've often wondered how he managed to raise that young daughter. Where he lived on Crow Creek in the Jefferson Valley, there were very few settlers living there. So when they married and went on to have 4 children of their own, Ben was one of the early cattle ranchers in Montana Territory, and he was often gone with the cattle. And so Lulu was really left much of the time to raise the children on her own. Again, she was cooking, she was tanning hides, she was sewing all the children's clothes. So she had an important part in that household. And one of the things that I met a woman who grew up on a Montana ranch and who lives here in the Midwest, and said she was told once by a woman who grew up in the Midwest, well, we don't do those kind of things because they're not ladylike. And this woman said to her, when you grow up on a ranch, you don't worry about what's ladylike. You just do what you have to do to get it done. And I think that is evocative of the kind of life that they led.
The ladylike thing now.
Yeah.
As Julia in the 1930s and her mother and grandmother years earlier are trying to navigate their way through this hostile world, how are they received by men?
Well, Julia, from every indication that I have, which are stories that her granddaughter tells about her from the guest books that people signed, everybody loved her. She was charming and charismatic and full of energy. And I think that she obviously had to have men help her, because back then, as a single woman couldn't even open a checking account on her own. So she did have to rely, as a woman of her time, on the help of men. And because she had worked on dude ranches before as a cook, there was a wealthy Chicago businessman named Julius Butler who helped her. There was at the time, one of the largest ranch owners in Montana, whose name was Charlie Anthony, who lived on a neighboring ranch. He helped her, and other people helped her. And I think they knew that she was a woman who could get things done. I think they had confidence that if they invested in her business, that it would be successful.
And not only is she while they're helping her, she's also still paying for it, because during
Absolutely.
the off seasons, she's helping fix their windows for their barns, doing that sort of labor. So she really didn't get anything handed to her.
No, not at all. Not at all. She had to do all of that. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet is so she ran the Diamond J. She started it in 1931. Obviously, Montana can be very rough in the winter, and you're not going to get a lot of people come stay at your dude ranch. She would have wealthy Easterners come and stay at her ranch, in many cases for the entire summer. And then when winter came, she had to find means of raising her family. So she decided that she would try to find a dude ranch in Arizona for the winter months to attract people there. So one of her guests at the Diamond J in Montana was Violet Westinghouse, who was the wife of George Westinghouse III of Westinghouse family fame. And the Westinghouses had a ranch they had houses all over the country, but they had a ranch in Tucson. And Mrs. Westinghouse suggested, well, maybe you can rent our ranch, lease our ranch for your winter ranch. And Julia went and convinced George Westinghouse III that she should do that, and he allowed her to take over that ranch. So she would every fall, she would, after the hunting season, because she always wanted to go hunting in October, after the hunting season, she would pack up the horses, the blankets, everything she needed, and with her wranglers drive to Tucson and set up shop, set up the ranch in Tucson, and have guests there over the winter. And many of her guests loved her. They would actually go to both ranches. One of her famous guests was Edgar Bergen and his ventriloquist dummy, Charlie McCarthy. In fact, he even drew a cartoon of Charlie McCarthy in the Diamond W guest book. So her charm, I think, and her resourcefulness and her hard work is what got her through.
So how did you find out about these great characters?
My brother is friends with a wonderful woman named Sherry Pepper, and Sherry Pepper just happens to be Julia Bennett's granddaughter. Sherry happened to mention to my brother one day, I wish somebody would write about my grandmother. She was an amazing woman. Actually, Julia helped raise Sherry and her brother. And I said, well, my brother mentioned it to me. And I said, that sounds like a really interesting story. That sounds like something I might like to write about. But at the time, I was thinking maybe a magazine article. I didn't know if there was enough information to write an entire book. But as I started researching, and I discovered that Sherry had Julia's memoirs that she had dictated. She had family photo albums dating to the 1860s. She had family scrapbooks. She had Julia's guest books. Wow. And she had a wealth of information herself, having grown up on those ranches. And I thought, well, this is a great story, but I still didn't know if there was enough for a book until I went to the Montana Historical Society doing some research and discovered Lizzie Naves Martin's diary that she wrote the year that she was living in San Francisco trying to make money as a seamstress. And when I learned about those women and knew that I had the details of their lives, that's when I decided this isn't just about one woman, it's about 3 generations of women, and there's definitely enough for a book here.
Oh yeah. So tell me, how did her diary end up in the archives? Obviously, it sounds like some of the family wanted to be remembered, including Julia, going to the trouble of dictating her personal memoirs to someone. They wanted their story told.
Yeah, I think because they were among the first Easterners to settle in the Montana territory, they knew that they had a story, and people who moved out there, there's a society of pioneers who kept records, and there's so much valuable information that's available in courthouses and in books. And it's fascinating to me. Yes, the Nave family has done some research, and members of the Nave family also helped me in my research when I learned about them. They were able to tell me about what it was like in the Jefferson Valley in the Montana Territory back at the turn of the century. And the diary, unfortunately, the entire diary doesn't exist. Portions of it exist, but those portions enabled me to track their stagecoach journey from San Francisco to the Montana Territory in 1867. It took a month to go, first via steamer and then via stagecoach from San Francisco to Virginia City, Montana Territory. Not an easy trip by any means.
Oh gosh, yeah. Just curious about the diary again. Is it a very literate diary? I mean, is it well written, or was it just sort of today I did this, yesterday I did this?
Yeah, it was mostly notes. It was mostly notes. She would note the weather every day because the weather was so important back then to their lives. She would note if the garden had insect damage, if the mosquitoes were bad, who stopped by the ranch, because there were, as travelers came by, some people would stop and spend the night at the ranch. And on the stagecoach journey, her young daughter, Luli, was ill during that journey, and she had to go to the druggist and get medicine, and Luli had a fever. And just imagining what it must have been like trying to care for her daughter while they were fording streams, and it was blizzarding at some points, and they had to take sleds when the stagecoach couldn't get through. And she noted all of those things, and she noted where they would stop for the night. So that enables me to track their trip and find out where they stayed.
Oh, that's amazing. By the way, once you got into the research and making field trips out to Montana, were you able to drive some of that route?
In the Jefferson Valley, yes, I was able to find, thanks to members of the Nave family who actually found me after I wrote an article about Julia for a Montana magazine. and grew up in that valley, they took my husband and me on a tour. So we were able to see the area where Julia grew up, the small towns where she lived later on, and being able to see those places, which in many cases haven't changed much since then, was really fascinating and helped me paint a picture in the book.
Right. Yeah, I also like the stories of some of the people on the periphery that you capture. The guy who runs the general store, who they have to buy not only supplies from, but they also have to pay him to bury their dead. It's to buy the thread for a funeral shroud, and this was the only guy there. It was a very lonely existence.
Yeah, I think it was, and I think they relished having the visitors come by. As I mentioned, there was a female newspaper reporter who I also learned about in the 1880s, who was assigned to travel from ranch to ranch and gather information about the families and write about how the ranches were doing. So that's an interesting story in itself. And another thing that helped me paint the picture of these places, there's a wealth of information. For example, there's in the town of Townsend, Montana, there's a museum who a wonderful curator works there who helps you find any sort of information you might need. And she pulled out the ledger from the general store in the 1880s. It's still there. And I was actually able to go through and see what the family had bought and what they had spent their money on. Mr. Bembrick, for example, drank a lot of whiskey. So it's that kind of detail that I think makes the story come alive. And I felt really fortunate to be able to find all of those details.
Yeah, definitely. That it really sets the scene. When you, by the way, talking about the newspaper reporter who goes out, when I read that, I thought this looks like a story in itself too. Is that a possible next project for you? It would give you an excuse to go up beautiful Montana again.
It very well might. I was really intrigued by that story as a former journalist myself. That's how I started my career. And to think of this young woman who was assigned by her publisher to go out on a horse, and she would spend weeks out on traveling through the valley and spending the night at the ranchers' houses, and then reporting on their activities and how the agriculture was doing. So yeah, I feel like there are a lot of stories still out there that haven't really been explored fully.
What is it that you, let's say I'm a person who is not particularly interested in the West. This isn't just a book about the West, though. Who would this book appeal to?
I think this book would appeal to anybody who's interested in strong characters, people who were bold enough to try new things, entrepreneurial women at times when women weren't entrepreneurial. Julia Bennett was an amazing marketer. And that actually reminds me of a story, a picture I wanted to show.
Yes.
In 1931, as I've said, Julia went to New York City for the first time to get guests for her dude ranch. Well, she had to go back for several years every winter because she needed to find more guests every year. And by the second year, she seemed to have gotten the hang of this. And she would wear her Western duds. And this image, which I hope you can all see, this is from 1932. And Julia is seen here. I'm trying to get the glare out of the picture. Julia is standing here with Chief Max Bigman, who had been going on a tour of the United States and had recently stopped and visited the White House. Well, Julia was staying in the Roosevelt Hotel trying to attract guests, and she would put on what she called shows for people to show them what the ranch looked like. She had film she brought with her and brochures. This is the new Waldorf Astoria hotel in the background. Julia is wearing her Western duds, and she was having lunch with Chief Max Big Man in the restaurant of the Roosevelt Hotel, and another man who was a Scottish explorer. And the photographer at the hotel found them and said, "Why don't you go up to the roof so I can take a picture with you?" And this is the picture that they got with the buffalo robe. Chief Max Big Man in another image is making the sign for Buffalo All Gone, which I find particularly interesting and ironic because Julia's father was one of the buffalo hunters who led to the destruction of the buffalo and much of the native way of life. So there's that interesting dichotomy there. That same year, Julia managed to get this big feature story about herself in the New York newspaper. So she was a marketing genius. And so anybody who's interested in business and entrepreneurship, I think, can learn something from this woman as well.
She could give a master's class. So tell me about some of the setup she would do with displays, bringing guns in from the field and the like.
Oh, yeah. She actually, in New York, she would take a big trunk packed with saddles and bridles and spurs and sagebrush. And she arranged to set up displays in the Northern Pacific Railway office, along with her brochures. And she said that people would stand outside the window and look at her display and talk about it, and she would stand there in the background and listen to what they had to say. So she also managed, one of her, interestingly, her daughter ended up marrying a wealthy East Coast man who had come to stay at the ranch with his uncle, and his uncle saw that display and is what led him to come to the ranch, to the Diamond J. So there are interesting stories about how many, from what I learned in my research, many East Coast people who went and stayed on dude ranches would end up marrying a woman, might end up marrying a wrangler. So there were romances that started there as well.
Interesting. And interesting too, how she knew to stand back and listen to the conversations of the people who were basically being sold her dude ranch. And I got to think too, that a lot of the people who would never have been able to pay $1 for a railroad ticket had to just have been thirsty and hungry for this. This was like a dream. They'd seen the movies and oh my, here's the West right in front of me. They just had to be so thirsty for it in this time of depression.
I think so. There was the romance of the West. There were the movies and then dude ranches back in the 1920s is when railroads really started. You know, the railroads went out west, and the dude ranchers realized, or the ranchers realized, there was an opportunity there to make money by having guests, and so the railroads heavily promoted dude ranches as well. I'm just looking here at the Q&A. One of the things says, does anything that you discovered about Julia in your research surprise you? And I guess that leads to what we've been talking about. I was surprised at her ability to go to a big city that she'd never been before and manage to charm people and convince them that they wanted to spend thousands of dollars. And we're talking thousands of dollars to spend their summer at the ranch. It was expensive proposition. And she would feed her guests only the best food and provide them with the best amenities. She would, if they wanted to go to Yellowstone National Park, she would drive them there herself. One of her mottos was, we'll help you do whatever you want to do. So I was surprised by that. And I was also surprised just by how much material exists if you go digging for it. I call it the joys of going down the rabbit hole. I was surprised that I could call the courthouse in Missouri and find Lizzie Naves Martin's all of the bills that all of the debts that she owed, spelled out in great detail. All of those papers still exist, and I was surprised at how helpful all of the people were that I had to call and say, do you happen to have a will from 1862? and they would go searching for it, and they were so helpful. So that was one of the things that surprised me as well, just the wealth of information out there and how kind and helpful people were in helping me tell this story.
And Lisa, you did it all in the time of, or not all of it, but the last maybe quarter of it in the time of COVID. Mm-hmm. Did the pandemic affect the pace of your work?
Despite all the terrible circumstances of the pandemic, because we were locked down, I had time to finish the book, and I had time to search for a publisher. And I was very fortunate early on to find the University of Nebraska Press. They have a division called Bison Books, which specializes in general interest books about the West. And so I was grateful to find them. So yeah, COVID did actually help get this project finalized and off the ground in an interesting and odd way, despite all the terrible things that came with the pandemic. It was interesting.
Another
and I see
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I see we have another question from
yes,
Thomas,
please.
Who says it was a very long process for you. It was like you took your own journey in Julia's footsteps. Yes, it was. How did you stay the course and keep your motivation going to complete this project? I just think it was so fascinating to me. I call myself a history nerd, and every time I would find something new, I would just get excited and go down that rabbit hole. I obviously had other projects and work and jobs to do during those 10 years. So I worked on it a lot during the summer. I would go out to Montana and do my research then. But it really wasn't hard to stay motivated because it was such a fascinating project to me. And I think that it might have helped that I'm not from the West, that as an outsider, Midwesterner, I had to really search and learn a lot about the history. And that was an interesting process for me as well.
Lisa, in any way, does Julia disappoint you? Were there moments when you found something out about her and said, "Oh, that's not my Julia"?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I loved Julia because I could see how her guests loved her, and I know how her granddaughter and grandson loved her. But of course, we all have our faults and foibles. And I guess I was disappointed that Julia had to rely on men for some of the things that she had to be successful in terms of money, in terms of financial support. But she was a woman of her time, and she didn't have many options. And so I understood that. But as a woman of the 21st century, I wish that she had been able to do some of that on her own without having to rely on men investors to help her. But overall, she kept me going because I was just fascinated with her.
Have you gotten any feedback yet from members of her family? Have they had a chance to look at the book?
Yes, I have. And actually, Sherry has become a dear friend. Sherry, Julia's granddaughter, and we talk frequently. And I think she's glad that grandmother's story that she wanted to be told is finally in book form. And I'm so grateful to her and her family for helping me make that dream a reality.
Did it surprise her, the success that her and the striving that her mother went through?
I think she knew a lot about her grandmother, but I think she was surprised by some of the things I found out about her grandmother. I mean, her great grandmother and her great grandmother, because although there were photo albums and things, I was able to, thanks to the fact that so many old newspapers are online now, I was able to find out things that people in the family didn't know.
Lisa, if you were to sit down and talk with Julia, if you had that opportunity, are there one or two things on your mind that you never really got an answer to that only she would be able to give?
Oh boy, there's probably a long list. I don't know where to start. I mean, the first one is I just want to hear her talk. I just wish there was a recording of her voice, because I think that that's something that I miss, that I wish I would have known her.
Oh yeah, the voice tells everything about a person, and none has ever turned up.
No, I've heard there was a film somewhere, but I haven't been able to track it down. I won't give up though.
Next summer.
Yeah.
By the way, if there is a movie, who will play Julia?
Oh, well, you know what? I have my own ideas, but I would really love to hear what readers think about that. So if you read the book, I don't want to soil the pot. If you read the book and you have ideas, feel free to email me through my website at lisahendricksoncommunications.com, or find me on Facebook at Lisa Hendrickson Communications and tell me. It might be a fun way to start a conversation.
Thank you, Lisa, very much.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful talk, Dave. David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Lisa, I have one quick question for you.
Yes.
Were you able to write in Montana out in the open, or were you pretty much writing when you went back home to Indianapolis?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I did do a little bit of writing in Montana. I actually did a few retreats, not in Montana, but in Indiana. Have a couple of friends who have weekend houses, and that was a great way to really spend several days just focusing on the project. In Montana, I mostly spent my time doing research and taking notes and taking pictures, and then coming home and trying to sort it all out.
So did you actually feel her there? I mean, in terms of in your mind that she's watching you write this and research this, and did you feel pressure?
I did feel pressure to get it right. I mean, I didn't want to make any assumptions. I wanted to understand. I tried to put it in historical context, so that people would understand, some of the things that we've learned in the 21st century about, the native population and how the settlers took their land and took their food source. I didn't want to write it in a 21st century context. I wanted to try to see it through the eyes of the people who were living it and understand what they were thinking. Because I assume that my readers are people who like history and who are who can understand that historical context. And so I wanted to put people in the place and time and understand what was going on in the world at that time.
Interesting. Well, Lisa, thank you for taking this journey and taking us along on this journey. Everyone, Nebraska Publishing, Burning the Breeze, 3 Generations of Women in the American West. Buy the book. It's a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to it. And thank you for joining us, the both of you.
Thank you,
Thank
Michael.
you so much, Michael.
Thanks for your help.
It was great fun.
Thank you, everyone, and have a nice evening. Good night.
You too.